Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay.
Hello? Um, dois. Good morning and welcome to our third day of the conference. Just to let you know that we have coordinate to reach the dinner place tonight. I think it's on the news tab at the on the news tab of our website. There are a map and some information on how to go to the dinner tonight. They will start at 8 o'clock, so maybe we can go together to there. It's some place like 10 to 15 minutes from here. So we can make a group or small groups and go together. And that's it. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to have here Alejandra Bronfman. She was very kind to accept a late invitation to be here as a keynote speaker. And thank you for coming. Welcome to the conference. And
Thank
it's
you.
all yours.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me? Good morning, buenos días, bom dia. I know that some of you wish you were listening to Ana Ochoa right now. I would also be very happy to be listening to Ana Ochoa right now, but I'm also very happy to be here and to get this opportunity to share some of my work with you. So I want to just first start out by thanking the organizers of the conference. It's been really, really fascinating so far. And I've enjoyed it very much. And I also just want to take a minute also to thank those of you who are presenting in not your first, but maybe your second or your third or your fourth language. I really appreciate it. And I think it's only through your efforts that this is an international conference. So thank you so much. So I just want to preface this by introducing the larger project just a little bit. It's a broader history in which I'm trying to do a kind of archaeology of non-written archives created by women, most of them from the Caribbean. All of the archives are in some way about the Caribbean. And I'm just trying to sort of think about what those are all about. There's a question of gender floating in this paper, and I confess that I haven't thought it through fully yet, so it's a little bit submerged in the paper, but I'd be very happy to talk about it in the questions. So here I want to focus on, I also changed the title about 6 times, so this is the tentative title, but it's going to change again. So here I focus on the history of ethnographic sound recording, beginning from the premise that the sound recording ought to be understood as a technology that generates rather than reflects knowledge. As such, it merits the kind of attention to context, materiality, and narrative that scholars have long devoted to written texts and visual sources, such as photographs or film. But what is a recording? We can get a little bit closer with Jonathan Stern, who argues that a recording is not an effort to capture a pre-existing sounds, but rather a process that, quote, creates and organizes sonic events for the possibility of preservation and repetition. That gets us a little bit closer to the ontological question, perhaps, but there are still epistemological, legal, aesthetic, ethical, historical, and other questions. Related to that is the question of the sonic archive itself. What of these collections of recordings? Who are they for, and how do they work alongside or against textual archives? What is our responsibility as scholars of sound to them? I may not answer all of these questions here, but I do want to raise them. So I approached these problems through the work of Laura Bolton, who produced about 30,000 recordings from all over the world. She recorded in Asia, Africa, North America, Caribbean, Mexico, Europe, Alaska, Brazil, although I don't know very much about her work in Brazil. Maybe some of you here do. She was also a filmmaker, photographer, collector of instruments, author, lecturer. She trained as a musician and an anthropologist, but did not have a conventional academic career. She produced commercial and non-commercial records, an autobiography, a handful of articles, but also networks and relationships that included Melville Herskovits, Leopold Stokowski, Igor Stravinsky, the New York and Chicago elite, and scores of informants and collaborators, many of whom are unnamed. Her career spanned over 40 years, beginning in the 1920s and continued on until the late 1960s. And I'm going to show a better image of this, but that's her there recording in Haiti. Her archive of sound and the musical instrument collection of hundreds of instruments are as neglected by historians and ethnomusicologists as they are vast. Perhaps they're underexamined precisely because they're vast. In my larger project, I'm interested in following her steps as she generated her archive and in attending to the kinds of social relationships, patronage networks, and the material and cultural circumstances necessary to bring sound recordings into being, understanding them not as transparent reflections of cultural fragments, but rather as the material remains of performances and transactions that were inevitably complex and the result of the work of musicians, interlocutors, porters, technicians, and others who generated recordings. In other words, I want to use the recordings as starting points through which to tell the stories of all the people who were involved in their creation. As that research proceeds, however, I want to use this paper to begin with the question of how to think about this career and this archive, starting from the premise that they've been neglected by scholars, not because they're unimportant, but rather because they transgress and blur many boundaries. Bolton enjoyed a long and prodigious career at the boundaries of and between the disciplines of anthropology, the music industry, and tourism. Working as, but never professionally trained as a natural historian or scientist or ethnomusicologist, none of these disciplines have fully claimed her. But this is precisely why she's interesting, and I suggest that disciplinary and institutional boundaries have obscured the work of people like Bolton, dismissing her as an amateur in all realms. There's been a tendency to either demonize or lionize the practices of early ethnomusicologists with not much space for nuanced analyses. My interest in her is not to constitute her as an ethnomusicological heroine. Rather, I want to understand the variety of impulses and circumstances that shaped the emergence of sonic alterity. Sound can be racialized and race can be sounded. Jennifer Stover Ackerman uses a notion of the sonic color line to think about the ways, quote, listening experiences both reflect and generate ideas about racial difference in an American setting. I'd like to suggest that the sonic exotic for people like Bolton was an operative concept that included color, language, geography, and ethnicity as it constituted and was constituted by cultural alterity, particularly in the case of travelers, ethnographers, and sound hunters who brought knowledge back from far-off places. In the absence of bodies, sound introduced people to the foreign and the exotic. For Americans, the collection of exotic sounds was part of the making of imperial space. I argue that the orality of empire was crucial to its creation and sustenance. This is an effort to think about the paths and trajectories of sounds of the global primitive or exotic that circulated mid-century alongside sounds of domestic others. To do so is an effort to decolonize this archive. But if we are to take sound as constitutive of a certain kind of imperial modernity, I think that we need to think through our vocabularies and framings. Some of the received wisdom about recorded music, ethnographic work of the 1930s and 40s, technology, and circulation need to be expanded and rethought if we are to understand the ethical, legal, and aesthetic dimensions of the creation of this sonic world. So in this presentation, and for the time I have remaining, I'd like to work on the biographies of some of these recordings. I picked Bolton up in Africa on one of her first expeditions, which was in West Africa. And I follow her to her next destination, the Bahamas, which was the first stop on a Caribbean cruise in the winter of 1936 and 1937, and included stops in Haiti, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Martinique. Those travels early in her career are a starting point for meditations on the ontological status of recordings, as well as my efforts to find the people in those recordings whose voices persist to this day. We can then follow the recordings and their re-entrance into the public ear after a stint in the archives. I offer some ways to reframe these. First, rather than traditional paradigms of salvage or redemptive ethnography, I think about notions of natural history and hunting. Second, rather than thinking about the ways nature is transformed into culture, I offer media natures and some thoughts on technology and cyborgs. Third, rather than clear pronouncements of ownership and property rights, I end with questions of purification and reanimation, property, haunted futures, and the general messiness of this thing called a recording. So first, hunting. Just before she left for her recording trip, Laura Bolton was living in New York. And to live in New York in the mid-1930s was to witness the success of the American song hunters John and Alan Lomax, who brought Leadbelly to the city in the winter of 1935 to both acclaim and notoriety. The practice of recording was getting some attention and recognition, and Bolton may have imagined herself as taking part in that cultural trend. But her intellectual and institutional contexts were very different from the Lomaxes, who worked within a folklore paradigm based ambivalently on notions of salvage and of redemption. Salvage ethnography is the dominant paradigm for this period, and especially the use of recording technologies, whether photography, film, or sound recording. The argument is that the notion of vanishing races organized the production of knowledge about indigenous peoples in the Americas, and that notion stuck even after the presumably vanishing races continued on much as before. The idea of saving and preserving cultures moved beyond the US and indigenous people there, and so the argument goes, informed much ethnography and knowledge production practiced in other parts of the world. Gage Averill argues, for example, that high among Alan Lomax's goals was to salvage the collective memory of oral cultures encoded in performance from loss or disappearance under the impact of global modernity. Brian Hochman's recent book also makes that case. Hochman's book makes important arguments about the mutual constitution of media and ethnographic encounters, but he doesn't interrogate the notion of salvage ethnography. I don't challenge the claim that salvage was a motivating force, but I don't think that it encompasses all of the recording work done at that moment. A related but distinct alternative might be what I'd call redemptive ethnography, practiced by people like the later Fernando Ortiz, Romulo Lasciatagnere, Jean Prismars, and Louise Bennett, and undoubtedly some anthropologists and ethnomusicologists of Brazil, inasmuch as they were seeking and rescuing songs, stories, sounds, and practices in order to redeem the place of African-descended people, and through them the nation. A version of this is the argument about African retentions as argued by Melville Herskovits, as a redemptive gesture that tries to redeem the capacity of enslaved people to survive in the Middle Passage and transport some of the most important elements of cultural practice and belief with them. Yet this doesn't seem to have been a driving impetus for Bolton. By the time she arrived in Haiti, she was thinking about the notion of African retentions, but this was more about pursuing particular rhythms and sounds than it was about thinking about their place in national narratives and the politics of culture. So if the notions of salvage or redemptive ethnography don't quite fit in Bolton's case, how did she imagine what she was doing? We might look to her own language, which doesn't talk about salvage or redemption, but about hunting. Here are some quotes from her autobiography. Taken from the autobiography written in 1969, these are some of the ways that Laura Bolton described her experiences on several expeditions to Africa in the 1930s. The expeditions were intended mostly to expand the natural history collections for the Museum of Natural History in New York and Chicago, and she was initially invited to accompany her husband, Rudyard Bolton, a naturalist who eventually became curator of birds at the Field Museum in Chicago. As a musician, Bolton seems to have taken an interest in the mission's oral dimension and learned how to use the complicated and cumbersome recording equipment in order to collect audible traces of the birds they were killing and stuffing to prepare them for display. Bolton expanded her repertoire while in Africa to the sounds made by people. She recorded songs in the instruments they played and collected those as well, and she also used different forms of media, including photographs and film, to document and hunt, in her words, what she deemed worthy of bringing back. It's clear that hunting is much more than a metaphor for her. Oh, here's just the title. It's a practice or a set of practices that are foundational to her pursuits. I never really thought much about hunting before, and I don't hunt myself. I don't know if anybody here does. But the resonances with the process of finding and capturing sounds are remarkable. Hunting involves multiple interactions with the hunted thing. Finding, identifying, capturing, killing, eating, preserving, displaying, and narrating are all part of hunting. And in that sense, they fit with Bolton's descriptions of her work on the expeditions. In Africa, they killed and ate birds, preserved and stuffed them to take them back to the museum, recorded their songs, and classified and categorized them according to the Linnaean categories. They trapped and kept monkeys as pets and used them as currency with locals. She hunted musical instruments with the same strategies as when she became interested in a particular curved xylophone, and she says, repeatedly traveled to some remote village in search of it. Finally, I sent out a messenger saying, don't come back until you find one for me. You'll be well rewarded. When it came to songs, she captured them whenever and wherever she could. The songs of their porters and cooks were, as it were, fair game. Anyone that crossed her path and was willing to be recorded has their voice caught on a disc. It's not that hunting for specimens and recording sounds were parallel enterprises. They were part of the same event, as there were songs sung during the expeditions and as part of them, and the stories told around the campfire at night, in some ways the sounds would not have existed without the hunt, and vice versa. Hunting may be a fruitful way to think about the collection of behaviors, including shooting film, taking photographs, and capturing sounds. The multiplicity of ends for hunted things fits the way she imagined what she was doing. There's less a pursuit of authenticity, although there's a bit of that, and more a pursuit of whatever she can catch. Indeed, it turns out that hunting and property rights are linked in US legal history. One of the debates about ethnographic recording is, of course, who do these belong to? Who has the rights? Who makes money from them? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. The origins of property rights, according to Trevor Reed, comes in part from hunting. As he points out, intellectual property law was founded in part through cases disputing the ownership of hunted wild animals. He writes, "Who owns a fox when one shoots it after another has chased it all day? The one who kills it, because everyone benefits from dead foxes. Who owns a whale that has been harpooned and left to wash up on the seashore? The one whose custom is both dominant and most economically salient." Copyright law takes its foundations from these rules. And, as he eloquently notes, in hunting law, no one ever considers the agency of the fox or the disposition of the whale. Specifically, when Bolton first began recording, compositions as written work were under copyright, but not recordings. And so for her, ownership was clear. If she caught it, it was hers. Of course, as I shall argue later, different groups of people she recorded had a variety of ideas about property and rights to songs. But here I want to pause on the connections between hunting, natural history, sound, and ethnomusicology. This connection to natural history is worth exploring just a little further because ethnomusicologists like to eliminate that intellectual current as part of their foundational myth. Her institutional support came from museums of natural history, and her training was as a classical musician. The impetus was not so much on collecting culture or folklore as entire things, but on collecting sounds conceived as artifacts and bits of evidence complementary to collecting practices of naturalists and ornithologists. The intention was not to find the most authentic or pure expression of a culture, but rather to cast as broad a net as possible and amass a comprehensive collection of sonic evidence. This is different from the folklorists, and I argue that it accounts for the overwhelming quantity of recordings made, as well as its categorical messiness. The songs are not easily categorized or cataloged, but that's precisely because she may have been less selectively about choosing only representative sounds. What's interesting, and I return to this later, is how that messiness gets cleaned up or purified in the process of commercialization. The hunt for sound extended to animals first and then humans. As the example of the early expeditions suggests, the collection of sounds was part of a broader practice of collecting as conceived in the field of natural history. The gathering, sorting, and displaying of material manifestations of the natural and cultural world emerged, as Robert Kohler has suggested, in the coming together of hunting, tourism, and the expansion of museums in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Natural history collections grew, he argues, in part due to the contributions of amateur hunters and birdwatchers. Certain conditions of infrastructural growth and changes in the economy produced both periods of leisure and wild spaces near towns and cities, both of which nourished and enabled the enthusiasm of middle-class men and women for pursuits in nature that blended science and tourism as they collected specimens and donated them to local museums. Moreover, during this period, natural history museums entered the business of sponsoring expeditions abroad as a way to enhance their collections. Though Kohler doesn't mention sound recording as part of birdwatching pursuits, it was precisely during this period and coinciding with Laura Bolton's first trips to Africa that Cornell ornithologists embarked on lengthy expeditions to collect bird songs in a joint venture with the American Museum of Natural History, participating in this impulse to collect and catalog the natural world. The bird songs and human songs constituted a sonic journal that Bolton produced during the African expeditions. It's tempting to interpret the seemingly easy move from birds to people as a symptom of a racist or imperialist perspective, in which exotic or uncivilized others are imagined as close to nature, sharing more with animals than with civilized humans in their lack of culture, and therefore easily categorized within the confines of natural history. This dimension may indeed have been present as part of Bolton's intellectual underpinnings. But anthropologists Stephen Feld and Ana Ochoa, there she is, among others, offer different tools with which to interpret the muddied boundaries among animals and humans, particularly with regards to sound. In their analyses of the Kaluli of Papua New Guinea and the 19th century Bogas, both argue that people in these societies drew from bird and animal sounds in their own music, and this is echoing a little bit what Georgina was talking about yesterday, and understood themselves to be in dialogue with their surroundings. It's a complex epistemology of natural history in which, according to Feld, humans and birds coincide and overlap in their production of sound. The sounds of weeping, at the core of Kaluli humanity and expression, are drawn from and resonate with birdsong. He writes, the strength of weeping derives from being the human sound expression closest to the sonic and emotional state of being a bird. In other words, the most human of expressions is also the most bird-like, and the boundaries dissolve. Similarly, for Ochoa, boat people in 19th century Colombia counted the imitations of birds and animals as a component of their musical expertise and understood music as often envoicing non-human spiritual entities through their drums and songs. Interest in birds, funnily enough, and their songs have revived recently in ethnomusicology. And I was just at a conference in which somebody talked about I heard mentions of birds maybe 6 times within the space of 24 hours. So there's something about birds these days. Mostly using echomusicological perspectives. And some of you probably know more about this than I do. So while Bolton doesn't necessarily seem to have paid attention to these cultural narratives like the ones of the Kaluli or the Boga, I suggest that they may have resonated with the people she recorded. What if the move from bird to human song echoed a soundscape in which, as Feld observed, birds and people and the sounds they made shaped daily life in important ways? The subsequent separation of bird songs to the ornithology lab and human songs to the archives is more about the misrecognition and denial of a fused sonic ecology in which animals and people co-inhabited. As Ochoa observes, it was precisely this concern to distinguish the human from the non-human that was a foundational move of early ethnomusicology. This is speculation at this point, but I offer it as a way to think beyond some of the facile critiques of the practices of natural history and ethnomusicology. It may be possible to think of the sound recording as the oral trace of 2 or more very different ways of ordering nature and listening to the place of humans within that order. A recording may be the convergence of distinct epistemologies. So on to technology and border wars. If thinking about Bolton means thinking across several boundaries, the work of Donna Haraway may be useful here. In her 91 essay, A Cyborg Manifesto, Haraway proposed to think about what she called border wars in the relationships among organisms and machines, and to stress the politics, the pleasure, and the responsibilities involved in making, questioning, and transgressing those boundaries. At stake in this, at the time of her writing, was creating a feminist perspective that also decentered humans and incorporated animals and machines in a politics of liberation from entrenched dualisms and gendered hierarchies. What if, she proposed, we embraced rather than ran away from our relationships to technology and machines and acknowledged the ways that bodies and power are constructed out of a number of fusions of organisms and machines? Haraway noted 3 particular borders, those between humans and animals, those between human, animal, or what she calls organism and machines, and those between the physical and the non-physical. As my brief summary of Bolton's work suggests, she played with and trod across those borders as a matter of course. More importantly, I shall argue, the musicians and singers she recorded and the local people who enabled her recordings inhabited those borders, and in so doing, left the deeply ambiguous traces with which researchers and the musicians themselves are still grappling. The introduction and early use of recording technologies resonates with Haraway's notion of border wars. The very notion of recording sound, as Stern has argued, arose in a context of a crisis of mortality during the US Civil War and efforts by many to preserve and reconstitute maimed limbs. The preservation of the voice was a way to extend the life of a body as it approached death. The lines among humans, animals, life, death, and the machines that recorded their sounds were not clear early on. The recording equipment Bolton used in the 1930s was complex and difficult to use. Capturing sounds outside had its challenges as it required knowledge and understanding of the relatively new machines. As she recalled, to have preserved anything at all with that early equipment was something of a miracle. The recording aspect of the expedition must have added considerable equipment costs and labor expenses, so the organizers must have thought it a valuable pursuit. Bolton's correspondence demonstrates considerable technical expertise with regards to the kinds of machines she preferred and their specifications. She seems to have been the only one on the expedition with the technical knowledge to requisition, operate, and troubleshoot the recorder, which would have been the most complex technology on that expedition. One might speculate that Bolton was not a mere appendage to the expedition, but rather that she represented the technological cutting edge and that a lot of the trip's energy and resources were dedicated to her needs. I would argue that Bolton's connection to a recording machine elevated her own status on the expeditions and shaped their trajectories. Haraway might have understood her as a cyborg of sorts, attached to her recorder and wielding a capacity to produce lasting material traces of ephemeral sounds. She herself narrates her history and the history of the recording technology as coterminous. Certainly, she writes, I have also lived the history of the recording industry. The equipment's weight and bulk required several porters to carry it, thus determining the size of the expedition. It was called portable, she recalls, but it took 6 porters to carry the recorder, large heavy-duty batteries, charger for the batteries, large boxes of discs, etc. In fact, those porters and crew also determined, to a certain extent, what she recorded. At times, our boat would stick on a sandbank and the whole crew would jump overboard. They would heave and shove to the beat of a rhythmic song without which the boys seemed unable to work. It was the time of Ramadan, and being Mohammedan, the crew fasted all day and feasted and sang all night. I collected many spontaneous performances of festive and religious singing, which I might never have otherwise obtained. Bolton's autobiography includes recurrent anecdotes about porters and crew singing as they carried the equipment, sometimes on their backs, sometimes on boats and vehicles, and producing material for Bolton to record even as they bore the burdens of the machines that would record them. Technology and organism fused in the work of the expedition as hired men gave their bodies and their voices to the ambition of collecting specimens of all sorts. Bolton's recollections acknowledge the recording apparatus as among the sound-producing objects she collected. Writing of her musical instrument collection, she notes that my recording equipment should perhaps be in this collection as well. At the same time, she hides the labor involved, the double labor of both carrying the equipment and singing into it. As Jussi Parikka might note, the materiality and labor of media making were inherent to the process, but they've remained obscure. Indeed, though there is a 2003 CD compilation of some of the recordings and images from this journey, the editors were unable to identify the musicians, and to my knowledge, no one has traveled there to try to track them down. As far as we know, they're lost. Connections to technological change are even more apparent in Bolton's recordings in the Bahamas. There, musicians had been firmly embedded in technological circuits before her arrival in order to survive the economic marginalization to which they were subject as a result of colonial processes. Bolton arrived in Nassau in December of 1936 on a yacht as part of another expedition for Chicago's Museum of Natural History. This expedition resembled a vacation even more than the African journeys, and much of Bolton's music seems to have been gathered at tourist haunts. Several recordings were made at the Prince George Hotel, recently built as part of an effort to boost tourism in the face of declining sources of income for the British colony. Sponging had been lucrative, but it was beginning to dry out. The US prohibition had produced many millionaires among the Bahamians who were able to successfully smuggle liquor in, but the demise had dried up a significant revenue stream. As the colonial government turned to tourism and built hotels and docks for cruise ships, many residents of the outer islands migrated to Providence Island and Nassau in search of steady incomes. For musicians, the tourist industry represented an unprecedented source of income. So ironically, in her search for exotic sounds, Bolton settled on several musicians rooted in and part of a techno-political move towards greater integration into the world economy that involved the construction and circulation of cruise ships, the building of ports, docks, hotels, and accompanying infrastructures of tourism, the implementation of instruments and microphones, and the circulation of songs meant to appeal to tourists, as well as produce a sense of authenticity for visitors from abroad. These musicians may have made the calculation that even if they were not to be immediately compensated for their participation, those recordings might lead to greater exposure and opportunities. So what of the product? The process of what Ana Ochoa might call purification, or Stefan Palmier might call cooking, is evident in the recordings that were eventually produced commercially for Folkways Records or other labels. The scraps of metal, the burdensome machines, the work involved, and the origins of many songs in a global religious tradition of Islam were peeled away in the liner notes Bolton wrote. Importantly, individual specific songs sung by particular voices were rendered in the abstract as tribal music, passed from disembodied mouth to disembodied ear. Here's a album cover of that Folkways record. The emphasis in both notes and recordings is on what she calls tribal music and the suggestion that the recordings were made in the field with no mention of Islam or of the hired men whom she recorded or of their intimate relationship to recording technologies. What remains are remarks about the instinctual and communitarian aspects of musical production and the natural practices of singing and playing instruments. From morning till night, I'll just let you read this while I'll play this a little bit of this for you, and you can, the musicians among you can help us out here. So the liner notes from the 1939 album produced play on the abstractions we've come to associate with sonic alterity. The constant presence of music, the tribe, the passage from one mouth to the next without instruction, the variation or individual input are all tropes that work against Bolton's own descriptions of the ways she encountered and recorded music in her expeditions in Africa. The Bahamian musicians never made it onto the Folkways recording or into her autobiography. In her notebooks, that music was marked for children's albums. I don't know if you can see, but right here says kids, and right here says children. So it's clear that she thought of this as not quite pure enough for a kind of folk album, but better for popular tunes. And I'll play a little bit of this for you.
Number 26.
My mammy don't raise no cotton, no corn, and very few potatoes, green beans and lima beans, Lord God, tomatoes, my dad.
So she chose to highlight instead in her lectures, LPs, and return visits the music of Haiti, which she identified as very close to and reminiscent of African music. Amidst this process of organizing and classifying Caribbean music in its seeming proximity to authenticity and Africanness, Bahamian music didn't quite fit. But there is, of course, a deep irony in marketing Haitian music as unfiltered African, full of unfiltered African retentions. All of her access to Haitian song was mediated by intermediaries, many of them American. There was Stanley Resser, for instance, a pharmacist who had arrived with the occupation in 1915, and others who were left over from the occupation, which had just ended. And we don't know much about the particular circumstances, but evidence suggests that the Haitian musicians on those recordings were very careful as to what they shared with Bolton and what they didn't. And actually, African music at the time was prohibited by the government. So the idea that this was kind of some sort of unfiltered tribal music is not quite right. Just play a little bit of that for you. Rather than purity, I would argue that what Bolton got was carefully organized and performed, shaped as much by the agendas of the musicians as by Bolton's demands. This question of control haunts the recordings, and I'm fascinated by what I imagine to be a range of reasons that people allowed Bolton to record them. Did they result from sheer mistrust or deception? That's one interpretation. And Tanisha Taylor has written very eloquently about the way people might have responded to Lomax's request that they sing for the microphone. If you were a Black person living in Waller County, Texas in the 1930s, and white men came to your door with notebooks, questions, and a voice recording device, you weren't thinking to yourself, let me be my most honest and authentic self. Even if you knew the men to be John Lomax and Alan Lomax, those men collecting songs from Black folks around and through these parts, you still didn't trust them. Or were they more sanguine about the process and more like those whose traces are in Bolton's archives? For instance, the US indigenous people who demanded copies of their recordings or who showed up at her Chicago listening parties in order to witness the reaction to their recorded voices. Bolton tells only the anecdotes in which people were eager to contribute to her archive. He was beside himself with joy, she writes, of an African man hearing his recorded voice. In the Bahamas, so close to Miami and so replete with voyagers who would have gone there, picked up music, brought it back, would they have been keenly aware not only of the sound they were producing and the impression they were making, but also of the commercial monetary value of those hybrid cultural forms? These were musicians who worked for a living and for whom music may have been a source of income in an unstable world. Thinking about the different ways in which people arrived at the moment of recording, the antecedents and understandings at work will lead to a fuller comprehension of those objects, less as documents of domination and more as moments of negotiated production and performance. Hovering over this paper in any work on Bolton or ethnomusicology is the question of voice, or more precisely, the recorded voice. It confounds the distinction between the physical and the non-physical. As many have observed, the voice is both of the body and outside it, embodied to the extent that it is always gendered, aged, and racialized, but also in its recorded form able to travel away from the body from which it emanated and to echo long after that body dies. This hybridity with ineffective boundaries between categories like physical, non-physical, or organism-machine raises many questions. For Adorno, it had to do with reminding us that the recorded voice was a new kind of thing that required a new framing. For others, the emphasis is on challenging the notion of the disembodied voice. They've pointed to the ways even recorded voices are always embodied and thought about the resonances and ambiguities in the grain of the voice. When we take voice seriously, we move from the abstraction of music to the specificity of song, sung by a particular person at a particular moment. For me, it is the sound of the reanimated voice that I find fascinating when it comes to questions of property, ontology, and the relationship of sound to the production of knowledge. The range of possibilities of how we might think about this question of property and ownership is broad. Some groups of people whose ancestors Bolton recorded are making more radical claims about property rights. The dissertation of Robin Gray narrates the return of some of those recordings made in British Columbia in 1942, and the community's understanding of them as stolen property. They argue that songs belong to families, and many are designated for specific ceremonies or occasions. They describe the recording process as theft, and have initiated efforts to fully control the recordings, including preventing them from circulating in the public without their permission. On the other hand, Aaron Fox has begun a project of repatriation working with a new Piat community in Barrow, Alaska, in which the aim is to begin what he calls community-partnered repatriation. According to the website associated with the project, he and his partner have actively involved the descendants of the performers Bolton recorded during her visit there in 1946 in decisions about what happens to the recordings. He's consulting them on all questions, including how to assign rights, where the recordings should reside, and what should happen to them in the future. And interestingly, and back to hunting, actually, the drums are made with hunted whale skins. And there's some wonderful work actually on the process of hunting and the ways that when they're making the drums, they actually honor the whales who gave their skins for the drums. Reading Fox's website, what's really fascinating is the extent to which repatriation extends the life of these recordings. Rather than sitting in an archive, they're heard, sung with, danced to, put on iPods by young people, explicated, remembered, and critiqued. If they're imagined as having a social life, as Arjuna Padarai once put it, their lives seem to have moved from a reclusive existence in library stacks, much like our lives probably, to one of active circulation, celebration, and remembrance, more like ABBA or Bruce Springsteen on tour. It's inspiring and reassuring. That's my musical references, sorry. Meanwhile, my own modest beginning with the Bahamas recording led to a radio program and a rekindling of interest in those recordings. I was in touch with the director of this radio station, and he was very excited about getting the recordings back. I delivered them all through email, and he put together a program and tracked down some of the descendants of the performers on them. Bolton's archive is interesting because it covers so much space and time, and ideas about the recordings vary so much over space and time. So we get this whole range of ideas about property and what to do with them. More theoretically, we can visit some of the debates about repatriation and the notion of cultural patrimony and intellectual property. In some ways, they fall short because there's a failure to consider what kind of thing recordings are. Anthony Appiah has thought about this from the perspective of what he calls cosmopolitanism, by which he means understanding that we share a common humanity, and that we need to be able to engage in conversations across incontrovertible differences. As part of this greater injunction, he interrogates the categories that we often take for granted as forming the basis of difference, most significantly culture and nation. When asking the question, whose culture, he takes on the notion of repatriation of cultural artifacts in the context of nations demanding their return. For a nation to demand the return of an ancient artifact, he argues, is absurd since that nation didn't exist when the artifact came into existence. It makes more sense to think of artifacts as belonging to humanity rather than to a single nation. Don't we all benefit, after all, from exposures to the items from Africa in the British Museum? And wouldn't Africans benefit from seeing Matisse paintings in their museums? Shouldn't we be encouraging the circulation of these artifacts rather than their sequestering? And in fact, to think about art as made by a people is wrong. Art is made by individuals, he argues, and if that's the case, then nations or peoples don't have a legitimate claim over them. From the perspective of an interest in music and recording, we can argue with him in two ways. First, precisely due to the nature of a recording, the struggles over the location of an artifact are much attenuated. One can duplicate a recording. It can be in two places at once. We can repatriate a recording and leave one copy in the Columbia Library or the Library of Congress. But at the same time, as both Lansfield and Nancy Guy have observed, the very replicability raises questions of copyright and ownership in a more urgent fashion, precisely because they can be duplicated, circulated, and profited from beyond the control of musicians or other contributors to the recording. And I'm sure some of you in the audience have thought much more about this than I have. But his second objective to the idea of cultural patrimony is clearly inadequate when it comes to music. Here he misses a step. With music, for instance, creation goes beyond the act of a single individual and involves, at the very least, a singer, songwriter, musician. Sometimes they're all one, sometimes they're not. How the lyrics came about, in how many ways it's been instrumentalized, how many versions are there? The answers to all of these would undoubtedly complicate or decimate the notion of a single creator. Moreover, as many have observed, traditional songs and melodies may have been created by collectives and may be used in particular ways by particular communities, all very difficult to capture within concepts of both creativity and usage as driven by individuals. At the same time, to rely on non-Indigenous understandings of property, law, and possession without taking other perspectives into account is to replicate, perhaps, the very thing we are critiquing. This opens a series of urgent questions that I don't really have time or room to address here, but I do want to suggest that the very nature of the recording as a hybrid physical, non-physical entity has created issues about property and rights that are not yet fully thought through. In addition to thinking through the histories of the recordings, it's become urgent to think through their futures as well. So just by way of concluding, I want to offer you this final image, and if anybody has, I would love to crowdsource this image if anybody has thoughts about it. I find it really fascinating. I'm just going to reiterate some of the questions I hope we can discuss further. How does Bolton, as a self-described music hunter who didn't comfortably occupy disciplinary or institutional spaces, allow for an understanding of the multiple sources of knowledge at the margins of ethnomusicology? How does attention to Haraway's boundaries and their crossing between the human and the animal, between organism and machine, and between the physical and non-physical, open up a space of inquiry that allows for the contestation of essentialized notions of race and culture? How can tracking the process of recording lead to new narratives about empire, technology, and the production of knowledge? I've tried to argue here that the biographies of sonic archives can be rich resources for thinking about how knowledge is made and working towards its decolonization. Thank you. I'll leave that there.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. And we have some time for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Alejandra. Very interesting. Of course, there are a lot of maybe parallel aspects to my research, but I was wondering how, I mean, a bit the methodology of your research. How do you work, and especially when it comes to listening to such documents? I was curious how, I mean, if listening is an important part of your methodology, and which type of listening situations, and if you have already had already experienced listening to these documents with some of the local people or their descendants.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, listening is a big part of it, and I'm not a musicologist. I'm not an ethnomusicologist, so I'm a big part of what I'm doing is educating myself in terms of what it means to listen to these recordings. And I have not yet. I've applied for funding. I'm waiting for funding. So I've listened a little bit to the Bahamas recordings with the people from there, but I have yet. I would love to go to Haiti, for instance, and listen to those recordings with some people from there, or even to get people to help me with some of those. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I mean, and when I say listening, I also really don't want to limit listening to a sort of expert musicological listening. I think I believe that there are probably other ways of listening to such documents.
Yeah.
With the idea that the recording is basically a starting point to create a collective situation and engage into this maybe reflection, or maybe just I don't know, some experience.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that one of the things that comes through in some of the recordings is the very collective nature of the recordings themselves, right? So you can hear how many different people are participating in them, and sometimes you can also hear people coming and going, and little kids and things like that, and so you get a sense of the context of the recording, which is one of the things I'm really interested in. I also really like the traces of the technology that remain in the recording, like in the Bahamas recording, when you heard that crackle. I think it's going to be fun to keep that in, and to keep thinking about those moments as well, the mediated aspects of it.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe this artifact of the recording also helps to listen to the medium and not only to the music. So that would be at least already two very different layers of listening.
Exactly.
Hello, thank you very much for your exposition. Taking the reference from Gilles, your question, and taking the reference of Alan Lomax that you mentioned, he says something about it, about the recording. He says something that we are used to hear in some way for the technologies, because we're recording ancient cultures with the same high quality that we recorded some orchestra in some theater. So what is the responsibility of recording these ancient cultures? In which way we taken this material to show to all the people to hearing this kind of manifestations of sound with this kind of technologies? We used to hear this all recordings with the same quality that we hear in Byronese. What is your position about it? It's something that I taken from some reflection from Alan Lomax in a book. What do you think about it? Of this archive?
So your question is, what's my position on the quality of the recording and the way that
in which way we taken this,
people used.
how we show this sound manifestation, how in which way we can learn to listen and show how learn the listening this kind of recordings.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question. And I'm very interested in historicizing all of that, right? So how did people at the time listen to it is what I'm interested in. How did she hear it, and how did people, when she put this stuff on the radio or released these recordings, what was their response to this kind of music? And she, I mean, one thing about Laura Bolton, you can say all kinds of things about her, and she's fascinating. There's a whole very gossipy aspect to her life that I have not talked about, but she was really expert in the technical aspects, and it's actually very interesting. Connects a little bit to Georgina's paper that I was just reading this morning in terms of gender and technology. She was really, you can tell from her correspondence that she was very, very in tune with the technical aspects of her equipment, and she was very particular about the kinds of equipment that she used, and very demanding to get just the highest quality stuff. So there's also that aspect, and it's precisely because she was trained as a classical musician, and she sort of saw herself in that moving in that world too. So there's something also about the blurring of lines between what kind of music is being recorded. I think that in that moment, and she also drew from people like Stravinsky and things like that, who had a very deep fascination for the primitive and primitive music. So if you think about the 1930s, there's all kinds of sort of elements going into the production of this kind of music. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, my question was in the high quality. We need to hear in high quality this music.
We need to hear it in high quality?
Yes. Do we need how we taking this responsibility of
yeah.
This is the best way to hear this kind of music, because we can do nothing about how they are recorded, because it's already recorded.
Yeah.
But how we taking this material to, in which way we aborded this kind of sound, in which way we make the show to other people, in which way we are going to hear it to show, and I don't know how to say it. Show to new generations how absorb this kind of
and now material. I see. Yeah, I think that's a very good question for that's exactly the kind of question that you want to take back to communities or places or descendants of people who have recorded those, right? I mean, I think that's a question for that needs lots of input from lots of different actors.
Thank you for your talk. I was curious about this period of the 30s. In visual anthropology, we have the work of Margaret Mead with Gregory Bateson, and I was thinking about this relation of exactly Margaret Mead with the technical aspects. I don't know if you know the kind of discussion they were having, and I think it's very interesting to think about the technical interest of these women that are working with traditional people, traditional music, or traditional dancing, meets, etc. And also, I'd like to hear you about this, because differently from her, Mead is an anthropologist, but is very interested in the technical aspects, but with the same kind of thoughts on how the technique is a way of approaching a scientific way of getting this kind of data, differently from Bateson, who was worried with more artistical and language aspects of filmmaking. So I don't know, just the period and the coincidence, I was thinking about this.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm thinking that through still. I think there's something about gender there, in the sense that actually, kind of paradoxically, some of these women were marginalized from their disciplines. Certainly Bolton was, and I think that the technology was a way for them to get in, to have some expertise that maybe some of the people who were more central to the discipline didn't have. some people who were, slower to, I mean, we all know old professors who refuse to use email, right? So, so I think that maybe one of the things that might have been going on is that this was a way for them to get an entry into, and kind of paradoxically, they're always, there's an image of, if you look at the image of Lomax, there's a woman in that picture who I think is, where is it? Right there. I think she may be actually having something to do with the recording. So initially the women were sort of the wives who went along and helped and this kind of thing, but also they took over the expertise of the recording technologies in a lot of ways. And that's something that I'm still kind of thinking through, is with all of my women that I'm thinking about in this larger project. But I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on it.
Thank you so much. Fascinating talk. When you mentioned the Lomax lead belly relationship, it made me think of some of the really interesting things that people like Carl Hagstrom Miller have talked about regarding what Lomax was looking for. And I know that you mentioned that Bolton doesn't necessarily have all of the same notions of authenticity, but I was wondering if, with your knowledge of her archive, you could talk a little bit more about her selection process, because there's only so many recordings you can make in a day. And you mentioned a little bit that certain recordings she made, but wanted to relegate to perhaps a children's album or something, as opposed to the core mission. So how did she, you could either say purify her archive, or at least just categorize it in terms of which recordings she selected and which she valued most?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and it's going to take a little bit more digging in her archive and in other archives. But I think part of it was that there was this, she was answering to commercial needs. So first of all, there was this kind of, there was a call for, and they used the word at the time for primitive music. So that's where a lot of the stuff from Africa comes from. And she also kind of dovetailed into the fascination with indigenous music. At the time, one of her earliest recordings was of indigenous people songs, but she was basically at the World's Fair in Chicago and went and stuck her microphone in performances. So she, I mean, and one of the things about her also is that she was, and I keep sort of going back to this, but I think it drove a lot of her decisions. She was marginalized, and so a lot of the decisions that she made were about money, about how to get by, how to scrape together a living. So if some of this stuff was, if the expedition was going to be funded, she went on it. If it was going to produce, possibly recordings that she could then sell, she would do it, right? And some of it was by accident. The yacht trip was, a kind of a lark, 2 weeks Christmas on a yacht with her husband, and that was just offered to her, so she went and did it. She became romantically involved with someone who gave her, who ended up giving her a connection to a job in Canada's National Film Board. So she went into to the northern regions of Canada and made films. She was not a filmmaker; she didn't know what she was doing, but so kind of by accident, kind of by necessity, she cobbled together whatever she could. And this question of purification is a really interesting one, and sort of how much agency she had in sort of curating the collection, and how much she sort of was very pragmatic about what she could sell and what she didn't is a really interesting question. Because if you look at her sort of the collection and the archive, it's a mess, right? Like it's a big mess, and she never really sort of went through and.
Who was buying? You mentioned, is it museums or when you
stuff?
Yeah.
So Folkways.
Who was she selling it to?
And then she had a contract with RCA.
Oh, okay.
Eventually, but she had really scraped by it with a contract for RCA, and then she did this lecture tour. Also, it's really fascinated by this lecture tour because it was kind of multimedia. She did the video, the film, and the and music, and she put together this lecture tour, and it was called Rhythms of the Jungle, in which she put together the music from Africa and then some of the music from Haiti and the most kind of African sounding music that she had found in the Caribbean. So the Bahamas stuff isn't on there, and there's actually a really just this moment when Rafael Trujillo, who was the dictator of the Dominican Republic, climbs on board the yacht, and he says, "Oh, here we are in this lovely yacht," and she has recorded that too, but that didn't make it onto the Rhythms of the Jungle. So it was it was very much about the audiences that she was going to be talking to. And I don't know very much about this lecture circuit, but I think that there were I think there was a kind of it was a thing that people did in the 1930s, is come back from these expeditions and share their experiences. So I need to know more about that.
More questions? No? Comments?
Oh.
No? Thanks. Hi, Alejandra, thank you for a wonderful paper. It was just great. Very, very rich. I wanted to just pick up the very, very opening, which is Jonathan Stern, and gauge your feeling about this, because the way you gave it, which may not be your commitment, was a kind of either or, you know, either it's about an attempt to capture a pre-existing sound, you know, or it's in fact about all these possibilities of recording, the reworking, the repetition, and so on. And it seems to me that we have to have an understanding that is about both, because in fact the what do we call it, the equivalent of the pro-filmic, the pro-audio, the pro-recording, the event matters. And you know, his very history of the recording of the dying and the dead, and my talk yesterday, which was all about recording my mum before she died, you know, so we're back to that interesting, you know, the Rottenbuehler and Peters argument about, you know, the analog is about the trace, the pro-filmic and the pro-audio trace of the event. That indexical relationship to something kind of matters, you know, and I still think that is the case, even if I also want to accept everything else that Jonathan says, Stern says. So I just don't think it's either or, but, you know, so that's, and that kind of, I wonder if you agree, that takes, you know, to the question. It really is about the Columbia project now, Aaron Fox's work about repatriation. You know, I'm very, very interested in it too. But I'd just like to hear you talk more about it. What does it mean, you know, as an equivalent? I mean, I'm genuinely puzzled. I don't have a position on this. But, you know, in as much as it's in some relationship to the return of objects, from, you know, physical objects from those, and human remains, you know, from the museums all over the world that have collected these things, often in violent or abusive ways, and so on and so forth. You know, what does it mean to talk about repatriating sound recordings? And, you know, when we go back to onto that complex ontological entity that is the recording, including the event, you know, what is going on there? And I'm just very puzzled by it. I'm very interested in the asymmetry between the repatriation of nail clippings and hair from someone's grandmother, someone still alive, and the return of recordings.
Yeah.
You know, it's just...
Yeah, thank you for that. I agree. I think that if I pose the Stern thing as either or, you're absolutely right. It's more than either or, and thank you for sort of helping me frame that. This was one of my original questions. What is going on, and this is why I'm kind of still kind of stuck on what is the recording anyway, right? But the more I learn about Fox and the project, the more I sort of come to see that the recording is so many different things to so many different people. And that's really what's coming clear in the work that he and two other people that I know about are doing in the repatriation. So there's the range, right? So Robin Gray, who I mentioned, she's a member of this community in northern British Columbia, and she, they take the stance that no, Aaron Fox, who has the rights to them legally, shouldn't have them anymore, and they should have the entire rights, and they should they should be allowed to take these songs out of circulation and have complete control over who manages them. And Aaron is all for that. He's like, fine, that's great. So Trevor Reed, who is another person who I cited here, is working with the Hopi recordings, and he argues that that some of the Hopi people were actually very interested in having their songs recorded, and the repatriation there has taken a very different kind of turn. There's a DJ, there's a radio station, and there's a DJ who's also an elder in the community who controls all of the recordings, and he actually has about 30% of them that he plays regularly on the radio, and about 70% of them that are forbidden, and they don't listen to them, and he's the keeper of them, right? And so, and Aaron and the work that he's been doing with the Alaska community is also very different, but they are all committed to sort of having a relationship and allowing those communities to have the greatest say in what happens to them. And as Trevor points out, I mean, he says that, we might have our ideas about what property is, but to sort of to ignore the indigenous ideas about what property is, and there's a huge range about what those recordings are and what they mean, would be just to sort of replicate those things. So I think that the part of the repatriation means just letting them go and seeing how many different things can happen to them. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick follow-up. You mentioned that's great and makes perfect sense, actually. And I know it's an experiment. I mean, in a sense, they don't have a kind of telos about what this is about. Yeah. The other thing, you mentioning the 70% of recordings that are not, as it were, that are not put into circulation reminds me of a project on my big group research project the last 5 years. We worked in northern India, and we were looking at North Indian cultural activists, they style themselves, who are now going around doing digital recordings of oral folk musicians, usually elderly, low caste women. So their music is being recorded, their songs, and then it's being put into circulation by these largely well-educated young male activists. And one of the issues, so what we're seeing is a kind of internal kind of colonialism, in fact, being enacted through sound here in northern India. And I mean, I just wanted to introduce another term, which is we began to see this as a kind of, if you like, ontological violence, because in this not really informed permission-based recording and lifting into circulation on the net, and often commodification, all under the name still of world music, there was a very, very clear dispossession going on, and one that was at really very extreme tension with what these elderly women represent locally, which is they embody the archive of a particular tradition of songs devoted to a saint called Kabir, who has a strong local low caste following. So it's part of the kind of embodied caste politics in this region. So yeah, I was just interested. I was talking with Gilles yesterday about the question of ontology being missing, which you've introduced in the paper, and I just wanted to put that there, that which also seems to be there in that repatriation project.
Yeah, it's definitely part of it. I mean, again, I just come back to the range of possibilities. I think that some, it's this notion of the ontological violence, I think it's very useful, but I would hesitate to sort of blanket everything that she did under in that category, because I like to think that the people that she recorded, some of them said, she can have this, I don't care, or maybe she'll sell and we'll eventually make some money or whatever, right? So there's the range, but yeah, thank you.
Any more questions?
Yes.
I mean, tell us to stop when it's finished, but it's really interesting. No, I mean, it's interesting also her comment, because exactly a woman who was also in India, Mushumi Bomwig, she's also doing this work of collecting music nowadays in Bengal region of India, and but because I was also coming to India with recordings to play to people, to initiate maybe responses. She was telling me, but come on, you've got this. You came 100 years ago to record us, and now you want to come back and that we listen to that. What's the point? And I think that was an interesting remark, where I was like, okay, what is at play here? That means if it's about decolonizing, or at least being critical about it, it's not only about the act of recording, but it's also the act of listening coming back, maybe. I mean, where another sort of layer of knowledge can be produced by listening to the recording and not only making the recording. And I guess that's also something that should be taken into account. And then the question is, okay, what's the agenda of such research projects, for example?
And again, it goes back to the range. So you see, in Aaron's example, where people are really taking them up and putting them on their iPods, and then there are people who, like, as in your example, sort of why revisit this? Yeah.
I'm afraid we need to start a new session in a few minutes, so maybe it's time to thank Alejandra again.
Thank you.
Thank you.